Hello and welcome. Tonight, we investigate a crime that is not remembered for its violence or brutality, but for its sheer, audacious coolness. It's a story of a man who, for a few hours, held an airline and the FBI hostage with quiet professionalism, and then chose an exit so dramatic, so impossible, that he didn't just escape, he jumped straight into American folklore. This is the definitive deep dive into the perfect crime, and the phantom at its center. This is the story of D.B. Cooper, the perfect skyjacking, and the 50-year manhunt. The afternoon of November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, began like any other at Portland International Airport. Amidst the holiday travelers, a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a dark business suit, a crisp white shirt, and a black clip-on tie, walked up to the counter for Northwest Orient Airlines. He purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle for $20. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. He was unremarkable in every way. Just another face in the crowd, a man who could be a mid-level executive or a salesman on his way home for the holidays. He paid in cash, walked to the gate, and boarded Flight 305, a Boeing 727. He took his seat, 18C, in the rear of the aircraft, lit a Raleigh cigarette, and calmly ordered a bourbon and soda. The flight took off on schedule at 2:50 p.m. As the plane ascended over the cloudy skies of the Pacific Northwest, Cooper handed a folded note to a young flight attendant named Florence Schaffner. Schaffner, accustomed to businessmen giving her their phone numbers, simply slipped the note into her purse, unopened. Cooper leaned closer. "Miss," he said calmly, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Schaffner's blood ran cold. She opened the note. The neat, all-caps lettering was polite but firm. It confirmed his claim and his intentions. He asked her to sit with him. He then opened his briefcase just enough for her to see what was inside. A terrifying maze of red cylinders, wires, and a large battery. Whether the bomb was real or a clever fake, she couldn't know, and it didn't matter. He then dictated his demands. They were precise and strangely knowledgeable. He wanted $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills, 4 civilian parachutes, 2 primary chutes and 2 reserve chutes, and a fuel truck standing by at Seattle-Tacoma Airport to refuel the plane upon arrival. The hijacking of the 1960s and 70s was a different beast than the terrorism we know today. It was a disturbingly common occurrence, often carried out by disgruntled individuals seeking passage to Cuba or making political statements. But this was different. The other passengers on Flight 305 had no idea anything was wrong. Cooper was calm, but as a gentleman. On the ground, the FBI and Northwest Orient scrambled to meet his demands. The 36 passengers were told the plane was circling due to a minor mechanical issue. For 2 hours, the Boeing 727 looped over Puget Sound, while federal agents frantically gathered the $10,000 $20 bills and procured the parachutes from a local skydiving school. At 5:39 p.m., the plane landed at SeaTac Airport. Cooper ordered the pilot to taxi to a remote, brightly lit section of the tarmac, away from the main terminal. He demanded that all the window shades in the cabin be closed to prevent police snipers from getting a clear shot. An airline employee brought the cash-filled knapsack and the parachutes aboard. In exchange, Cooper, true to his word, allowed all 36 passengers and flight attendant Florence Schaffner to deplane. He had his ransom, but his plan was far from over. He then laid out his bizarre and highly specific flight plan to the remaining crew in the cockpit. They were to fly to Mexico City, a destination chosen to ensure they had enough fuel for a long flight. But the conditions he demanded were what baffled the pilots and the FBI. The plane was to fly at the minimum possible airspeed without stalling, approximately 100 knots. It was to fly at a low altitude of 10,000 feet. The landing gear was to remain down, and the wing flaps were to be lowered to 15 degrees. And most crucially, the rear ventral air stair of the Boeing 727, a unique feature of the aircraft that could be opened in flight, was to remain unlatched and lowered. These were not the demands of an amateur. The crew protested that flying all the way to Mexico City under these conditions was not safe. Cooper, ever the pragmatist, conferred with them and agreed to a refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. At 7:40 p.m., Flight 305, now with only Dan Cooper and a skeleton crew of 4 aboard, took off from Seattle and headed south into the dark, stormy night. The weather was terrible, with heavy rain, freezing temperatures, and strong winds. The crew was instructed to remain in the locked cockpit. The last they saw of Cooper was him tying the money bag around his waist. Around 8 p.m., a warning light flashed in the cockpit, indicating that the aft air stair had been opened. The cabin pressure changed. The crew spoke with him over the intercom. Cooper told them everything was fine. At approximately 8:13 p.m., somewhere between Seattle and Reno, over the rugged, forested wilderness of southwestern Washington state, the pilots felt a sudden upward movement in the tail section of the plane. The Phantom, who called himself Dan Cooper, along with his $200,000 ransom, had jumped from the back of a commercial airliner at 10,000 feet into a freezing 200-mile-per-hour windstorm and into history. When the plane landed safely in Reno 2 hours later, all that was left of him were 8 rally cigarette butts, his black clip-on tie. Thus began NORJAC, or Northwest Hijacking, one of the longest, most expensive, and most frustrating investigations in the history of the FBI. The immediate challenge was figuring out where he had jumped. Based on the flight path and the pressure change, they estimated a vast, rugged search area along the Washington-Oregon border. A massive ground search was launched, involving hundreds of soldiers, FBI agents, and local police. They combed the dense, mountainous terrain for weeks. They found nothing. No parachute, no briefcase, no money, and no body. It was as if he had been swallowed by the night sky. The FBI began the painstaking process of piecing together who this man was. The name Dan Cooper was quickly identified as an alias, likely taken from a popular French-language Belgian comic book hero. A media miscommunication led to the press dubbing him D.B. Cooper, the name that would stick in the public consciousness forever. The only physical evidence he left behind was his tie, the tie clip, and the cigarette butts. For decades, this evidence yielded little. But in the 2000s, new forensic analysis of the tie by citizen scientists revealed traces of rare earth elements, including pure, unalloyed titanium. This suggested that Cooper may not have been a simple woodsman, but perhaps an engineer or a manager at a high-tech aerospace firm, a place like Boeing where such materials were used in the 1960s and 70s. For 9 long years, the case grew colder. There were no credible leads, no new evidence. The FBI investigated and dismissed over 800 suspects. The legend of D.B. Cooper grew. He became a folk hero, an anti-establishment icon who had beaten the system. T-shirts and songs celebrated his audacious crime. He was the man who had the guts to take on the corporate world and the government and win. Then, in February 1980, a miracle happened. An 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was on a family camping trip on the banks of the Columbia River at a spot called Tina Bar. While digging a fire pit in the sand, his hands brushed against something. He pulled out 3 rotting, rubber-banded bundles of cash. The bills were decomposed but still identifiable. When his family turned them over to the FBI, the serial numbers were checked against the D.B. Cooper ransom list. It was a perfect match. A total of $5,800 of the ransom money had been found. The discovery was a bombshell, but it created more questions than answers. Tina Bar was miles downstream and west of the official jump zone. How did the money get there? Did Cooper land in the river and drown, the money eventually washing ashore? If so, where was the rest of it? Or did he survive the jump, make his way to the river, and bury a portion of the money there for some unknown reason. The discovery proved the story was real, but it did. Did he survive the jump? The FBI long maintained that he almost certainly did not. He jumped at night into a freezing storm with wind speeds over 200 miles per hour at that altitude. He was wearing only a business suit and loafers. He was parachuting into a rugged, unforgiving wilderness. The parachute he chose was an older, non-steerable military model, and the reserve chute he was given was a training chute that had been sewn shut, a fact he likely did not know. The odds of surviving the jump, the landing, and the harsh elements were astronomically low. However, proponents of his survival point to his calm demeanor and his apparent knowledge of the aircraft. He was not a fool. He may have been an ex-military paratrooper with experience in rough jumps. The discovery of the money at Tina Bar, some argue, suggests he survived long enough to reach the river. The second question, of course, is who was he? The list of suspects is long and varied. One of the earliest and most famous was Richard McCoy Jr., a Vietnam veteran who, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, carried out a nearly identical crime, hijacking a plane for $500,000 and parachuting out over Utah. McCoy was caught, convicted, and later killed in a shootout with the FBI. While the similarities were striking, McCoy didn't perfectly match the physical description of Cooper and always denied being him. Over the years, numerous deathbed confessions have been reported. A man named Dwayne Weber told his wife, "I am Dan Cooper," shortly before he died. Another man, Lynn Doyle, L.D. Cooper, was named as a suspect by his own niece, who recounted a story of her uncle coming home to a family Thanksgiving in 1971, battered and bruised, claiming he had been in a car accident after a day of turkey hunting. He matched the physical description and had a military background. More recently, investigators have focused on Robert Rackstraw, a Vietnam veteran with extensive parachute and explosives training, a pilot, and a criminal past. He was investigated by the FBI in the 1970s, but was eventually ruled out. However, a team of private investigators led by filmmaker Thomas Colbert has amassed a large body of circumstantial evidence suggesting Rackstraw, who died in 2019, was the real Cooper, a man who loved playing cat-and-mouse games with the authorities. In July 2016, after 45 years of active investigation, the FBI officially closed the D.B. Cooper case. They concluded that the resources could be better used on other priorities and that they were unlikely to ever definitively solve the mystery. The file remains open, but the manhunt is over. D.B. Cooper remains America's only unsolved skyjacking. He is a ghost, a legend born of a single audacious act. The mystery endures because it represents a fantasy of escape. In a world of rules, taxes, and authority, one man, with quiet confidence and a briefcase, simply decided to check out. He demanded a fortune, and then, rather than landing in another country, he chose the most dramatic exit imaginable. He stepped out into the void. Did he fall to a lonely death in the cold, dark woods of Washington? Or did he pull off the perfect crime, living out his days with a secret smile, a modern-day folk hero who simply flew away? The answer, like the man himself, is lost to the wind.